Would you like me to give you like a brief explanation on the topic?
No, you just mentioned the title.
Okay, so the title we have is Being Muslim in America, Melting Pot of Muslim and American Culture. So, let's see. I could start. Okay, I think we can just go ahead. Already?
For Q&A, Mike, I have to talk this up there.
Oh, okay.
Q&A, so you don't need to.
Okay, yeah, that's me.
Let them reach the mic.
Okay.
Okay, 30 seconds.
Oh, just
10 seconds. Brother and sister, the event will be start very soon. After the session, any Q&A, any question, please reach this microphone on the middle of the room. All right, sister, thank you.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. How's everyone doing this evening? Good? You're holding through it? Awesome. So let me start first. Rabbi Shirley Sadri, Waysirli Amri, Wahlul Uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. So today we have Sheikh Saad Taslim. Born and raised in the U.S., Sheikh Saad Taslim is highly in tune with the struggles and pressures that today's youth face. As one of the youngest Al-Maghrib instructors, he is educated in traditional Islamic sciences. Sheikh Saad Taslim dedicates his teaching to Muslim youth, learning to balance their Western lifestyles with Islamic values. His primary message is to empower Muslim youth to become comfortable with their own personal identities as part of Western society. So without further ado, Saad Taslim.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما يا رب العالمين. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I want to start off, inshallah ta'ala, by first of all saying thank you for having me. It's my first year coming to this convention, alhamdulillah. I was actually just coming down on the elevators, and there was a brother, it seemed like he was Indonesian. He was wearing a badge. So I saw the badge, and I said, Assalamu alaikum. And he looked at me, and he said, Wa alaikum assalam. And then he's like, who are you? Like, what are you doing here? I'm like, what do you mean? He said, where are you from? I said, well, I mean, it depends. In my mind, I'm thinking that could be a number of answers because I was born in America. I was born in Georgia, actually. My parents are originally from Pakistan. I was raised in Maryland. So it could be a number of answers to that. And then I could tell he's a little confused, and I apologize if the brothers, I don't know if he's actually here. But he said, are you here for like the conference? And I said, no, before that, he said, so are you like, is your wife Indonesian? Like, what's going on? And I said, no, I'm here because I'm Muslim, right? And he's like, oh, okay, I've just never seen you before. I said, no problem. And he said, I guess you're one of the speakers. Like, I know he had to make sense of it somehow. So I said, yeah, I'm one of the speakers. And then he looked at me and looked, I guess the way I don't know. But he said, for the youth? And I said, well, I do speak to the youth, but I'm not youth specific, right? Because I guess even as a speaker, maybe the way I look didn't quite, gel with the idea of like a speaker or a sheikh or an imam or whatever, our image of an imam or a speaker is. And I get that a lot, right? I get that a lot. I remember, subhanAllah, having a conversation with my dad. And my dad, alhamdulillah, born, raised Muslim, and he also had like an idea of what an imam or a speaker should look like. So when I graduated from the University of Medina and I started teaching and so on and so forth, he saw that I get invited out and, I give lectures and talks and all that. And one day he looks at me and he looked at the way I was dressed and he goes, "People take you seriously?" And I said, "Not all people. The reality is that there are people who do look at me and I don't meet their perception or their idea of what a speaker should look like. On the other hand, there is a whole generation of people who take me extremely seriously. And actually they take me, and this is not to praise myself, I'm just talking about our perception. And I said there's a generation of people who take me more seriously than a lot of other people because they can relate. Because they look at me and they can see themselves in me. And my approach has always been, in my teaching and giving da'wah and lecturing, and I spoke about this earlier this morning as well when we had a youth session, but my focus has always been to bridge the gap between this idea or this ideal of Islam that we have and the real world Islam, like the Islam that we are actually living. And I say that because oftentimes there seems to be these two different pictures that we have of Islam, these two different ideas. One is like the ideal that we have of Islam and, the Islam of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, and that early generation or those early generations of Muslims. And then, like, that's well and great. And then we come to real life. And, a lot of us, especially the younger generation, but this is not specific to the youth. But for a lot of us, we're like, okay, that's well and great, but, my Islam is maybe different because I'm living in the real world and I have real world challenges. And the society that I'm living in is not the society of the Sahaba. It's not the society of the companions. The culture that I'm living in is not necessarily a Muslim culture. And so that's why for me it's very important to talk about these issues. It's important to talk about culture. It's important to talk about identity. It's important to talk about where we fit and where we belong. And it's important to talk about the place that Islam has, not only in this society, in this culture, but in all cultures. Because one of the miracles of Islam, one of the amazing things about Islam, is that it was never ever meant for just one culture. It was never ever meant for just one time period. It was meant for every time period. Until the day of judgment, Islam will be applicable. And every single culture, every single society, Islam is supposed to gel with every culture that comes into contact with Islam. And this idea that there is somehow some difference or there is a problem between our culture and Islam, or that Islam opposes culture, or that Islam goes head to head with a local culture, this idea is more of a modern day idea. This is more of a modern day problem. And the proof for that is Islamic history. If we look throughout Islamic history, we don't see a conflict between Islam and culture. And that is why till today we see the remnants of that. And that's why if we go to Saudi Arabia, what does Islam look like? We're talking about, outwardly appearances. What does it look like? Well, it looks Arab, it looks Saudi, right? If we go to Pakistan, what does Islam look like there? It looks like Pakistanis. If you go to Indonesia, what does Islam look like? It very much looks Indonesian. If you go to China and so on and so forth, Africa, any part of the world, and you see that at least visually, Islam looks very different. Yet, when all of us come together, maybe in a gathering like this, or maybe even a larger gathering, those of you who've made Hajj or Umrah, we find Muslims from all over the world, and surface level, it seems like we're all very different. The type of clothes we're wearing, different. The language that we're speaking, different. Our food choices, different. Our certain habits are different. Certain norms that we have are different. Yet, you can turn to any single human being during Hajj or Umrah and say to them, Assalamu alaikum, and they will say to you what? Wa alaikum assalam. You will get up and pray salah, and they will get up and pray right next to you. You will be making dua, and they'll be making dua right next to you. You are there to pour your heart out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to seek forgiveness, to seek closeness to Allah, to increase in your spirituality. And those millions of people, and it's literally during Hajj, it's millions of people from hundreds of different backgrounds and hundreds of different cultures, they're all there, inshallah ta'ala, for the very same purpose. And so that shows us that throughout history, there wasn't a conflict. Not, for the most part, there was no conflict, and Islam would come to a land, and that the culture, the people would not feel that their identity is being threatened. Yes, there was a difference in aqidah. There was a difference in belief and creeds. And yes, if the society or if the culture had morals that were wrong, or there was oppression, or there was dishonesty, or anything bad, then yes, Islam would come and remove that from the society. So Islam would take what is already found in a culture, the goodness found in the culture, and highlight that goodness. And that is why, even from my personal experience, when I travel to different parts of the world, and I've been to many parts of the world, and I've seen Islam practiced all over the world, not only here in North America, but also in Europe, and I've been to Asia as well, and obviously the Middle East, and so on and so forth. What I find is, if you look at the culture of the people, you find Muslims living in that culture, they always bring out the best that that culture had to offer. And that's why, I've spent a lot of time in Malaysia, for example. And when I go to Malaysia, and you can talk to anybody who's been to that part of the world, Malaysia, Indonesia, so on and so forth, they'll always say that, especially people who haven't been there before, they're not familiar with that culture, they'll say, people are so kind, people are so gentle, right? That Islam, that aspect of Islam is so visible there. People smile a lot, right? Well, that was already found in the culture, but Islam brought it out and highlighted that aspect. Likewise, you go to the Middle East, for example, and you find how they take care of their guests. They go out of their way to feed their guests. They go out of their way to take care of their guests. They will take their own clothes off of their back and give you clothing if you don't have clothing. And we find this and we say, look at this beautiful aspect of Islam that is highlighted, that is brought to the surface because Islam came. And we find this happening with the Prophet ﷺ. That even in the society of the Prophet ﷺ, there were certain aspects certain ideas, certain morals that we now consider to be Islamic morals that were already found amongst the Arab at that time, at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And Islam came and it highlighted those matters. And so, as I said, this idea that there is always a conflict between culture and your Indian that gave them their shahada, right? Because in their mind, the person who, helped this person in their Islam, they're like, look, this is what a Muslim is supposed to look like. When in actuality, when we talk about a culture, a specific culture, Islam has no specific culture, right? And that's why I teach a class called Trends, in which we talk about culture at great length, culture and identity. And one of the discussions we have in my seminar is, I ask the question, is there a such thing as Muslim culture? And you see some people saying yes, some people saying no. People who say yes, they say, yeah, well, there is Muslim culture because certain matters are common amongst all Muslims. And if we were to say, yes, there is a Muslim culture, it would mean that all Muslims across the world, they all agree on those matters that make up that culture. So I usually question the person who says, yes, there is a Muslim culture. I say, okay, give me examples. And they say, giving the salam, eating with your right hand, so on and so forth, dressing modestly, and all of these examples. And we say, okay, let's put this to the side for a second, right? On the other hand, those who say, no, there is no one Muslim culture, they say, well, you look at the norms and you look at, cultural habits, they differ from place to place to place to place to place, right? And so the conclusion that we come to, and I'm saving you, having to attend the whole seminar, but the conclusion that we come to is that if you want to refer to matters found in Islam as culture, then go ahead. but we would just call that Islam. So whether it is dressing modestly or certain eating habits or certain purification habits or saying assalamu alaikum and generosity and being kind to your neighbor and being good to your guest or whatever, well, if this is Muslim culture, for me this is a downgrade of those aspects, because those aspects come from a higher place, and that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is not culture. That is simply Islam. And that is why Muslims across the world have that in common. But if we're talking about culture itself, then no, there is no one culture that we would say this is Muslim culture, right? No, there's no culture in the world that has monopoly over Islam. Doesn't matter how many Muslims you have. And actually, subhanAllah, in my class, it's very interesting. I have this discussion where we talk about, when we think of Muslim culture, what do we think of? And most of the time, people think of like Arabs, right? And one of the examples that I give in my class is, well, with all due respect, Arabs, there's no one Arab country that has the largest Muslim population. Do you know which country has the largest Muslim population? Indonesia. Y'all should know this, subhanAllah, right? You should be, I thought when I'm going to come here and say this, I would be like, yes, Indonesia, right? So the largest population, so if we're going to take one culture and be like, this one culture deserves to be the Muslim culture, you know what culture it would be? The Indonesian culture. But we don't do that, right? Because no one culture has monopoly over Islam, right? Islam has been sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be practiced in all cultures. And to actually, Islam even helps us maintain cultures at times. And I want to share with you an incident that occurred during the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which actually proves this point. And this is a very important point when it comes to understanding the difference between Islam, our religion, and culture. Islam doesn't change, okay? Islam stays constant. The Sharia stays constant. The Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent it, and Allah has preserved it until the Day of Judgment. It's not going to change. Our culture changes constantly, whether we like it or not. And this is what I usually tell parents, right? That you can try to hold on to a particular culture, but it's not in your grasp. You cannot force your culture to stay constant and consistent. This is not right or wrong. This is reality. No matter how much we try to say, look, you have to hold on to this one aspect or this one place in our cultural history, not going to happen. Our culture is constantly evolving on its own. Even somebody who says, look, I want to hold on to my Indonesian culture and I want it to stay constant, you can try, but the very fact that Indonesians are intermingling with people of other cultures living in America means that the culture will change. The culture will evolve. The culture will take on a different shape. And that is why we find the generational gap, the generational difference. And that is why the old, maybe the parents in the room or the little bit older generation of Indonesians, you will find you share the culture with your kids, but your kids' version of Indonesian culture looks different, right? And I'll tell you, subhanAllah, I saw one of the things that I usually look at when I go to youth talks and I give talks to the youth is I always look at the way people are dressed, right? Because it's very interesting to me, and I have a background in art and design and so on and so forth, and I always look at also people's footwear. And I noticed, I looked at the youth and I looked at their kicks and I was like, mashallah. I don't know how many youth we have, how many young people we have in the room right now, but I saw somebody wearing Comme des Garçons Converse Chucks. And I think maybe there's a couple people who know what I'm talking. Maybe not, right? But that's a very specific footwear. It's a very specific designer. And I thought to myself, this person is wearing those Chucks, right? Those Converse. But I know for a fact their parents, number one, they would never wear that. Number two, they probably have no idea what that even is, right? And that's why, as I said that designer's name right now, I know like most people are like, what is he talking about, right? But there's that next generation that cares very, very much about the design, someone who designed their footwear, right? Their sneakers or their kicks, right? There's nothing you can do about that, right? There's not, as much as you try to say, no, you have to look like me and you have to dress like me and you have to, it's not going to happen, right? The culture is going to change and evolve. And that is why Islam has that flexibility to be practiced, not just practiced, by the way, practiced to its fullest degree regardless of the culture, right? And I'll share with you an example of something that happened during the life of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that clarifies this issue. Incident mentioned in Sahih Muslim. And some of you may have heard about this incident. But basically, in this incident, the Prophet ﷺ is invited to eat. And the Prophet ﷺ has with him the famous companion Khalid ibn Walid. Right? Khalid ibn Walid and the Prophet ﷺ are sitting, and they present some food to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ, the food is given to him. He is about to reach forward. He's about to take a bite of the food. And a woman stands up, and she says, hold on. First tell the Messenger of Allah ﷺ what you have served him. Now, why did she say this? She said this because this was the norm with the Prophet ﷺ, that if something new was being given to the Prophet ﷺ, they'd always identify what it is, because the Sharia is still being legislated. The Islamic rulings are still being revealed. So it may be that they're giving something to the Prophet ﷺ and they don't know the ruling of it. Is it permissible? Is it not permissible? Is it good? Is it bad? So when something new would be presented to the Prophet ﷺ, they would always tell the Prophet ﷺ, this is this. Identify what it is. And by the way, even for us, subhanAllah, when we're dealing with other cultures and so on and so forth, we're dealing with a new people, part of our Muslim character is that we always tell people what we're giving to them, what we are presenting to them, just in case maybe they're not comfortable with it, right? Maybe they're not okay with it. For example, the whole debate between halal meat, right? Dhabiha, non-dhabiha, and so on and so forth. So it is from our etiquette that, it's a difference of opinion on this matter. Some people consider certain meat to be halal, other people don't, and so on and so forth. So if we don't know the person, it is from our etiquettes that we tell them, where that meat came from and so on and so forth. And I don't really want to get into that issue. Actually, I shouldn't have even mentioned that example. But anyway, so that was the habit of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. So this woman, she says, tell the Prophet ﷺ what you've served to him. And they tell the Prophet ﷺ, they say it is roasted lizard, right? Al-dhab. And the Prophet ﷺ, you can imagine, he's reaching forward. He's about to take a bite of this food, and he hears al-dhab, lizard, and he pulls his hand back, right? Meaning he's about to take a bite, but then he decides not to. And Khalid ibn Walid, radiallahu anh, sitting next to the Prophet ﷺ, he sees this happening, and he says, "Aharamun al-dhab ya Rasulullah?" He says, "O Messenger of Allah, is al-dhab, is lizard, is it haram? Is it impermissible for us to eat?" Because what he sees is that the Prophet ﷺ didn't eat it. So now he clarifies. He asks the question, is this haram? And is this permissible for us to eat this? The Prophet ﷺ says, no, it is not haram. He says, however, it is not found. This food, this type of food, is not found in the land of my people. Fi ardi qawmi. It's not found in the land of my people. Yani, what he's saying is, my culture, my people, we're not used to eating this. Right? It's not normal for us to eat this. He goes on to say, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so I don't have a liking for it. Meaning, I don't like it. Right? He just says, I'm not used to it. We don't eat it in my culture. Yani, he says, in my land, right? This is not common, so I don't like it. And you know what? If this hadith had ended right here, it would have served one of its purposes. Because when we study Islam, when you study Sharia, this hadith is often brought in the chapter dealing with food. What foods are permissible, what foods are impermissible for us to eat. And this is an evidence that proves that it is permissible for Muslims to eat lizard. Right? Because Prophet ﷺ was specifically asked, is this haram? He said no, meaning it's halal. But the hadith doesn't stop there. Khalid bin Walid goes on to then say, after that, so he asked Prophet ﷺ, Prophet ﷺ said, no, it's not haram, but I don't like it. My people don't eat it. It's not common amongst my people, so I don't like it. Khalid bin Walid then goes on to narrate. He says, then I sat in front of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and I ate the lizard. And he even said, and I was chewing the lizard. And the Prophet ﷺ was looking at me the whole time. Now, what is the point of mentioning that detail? Right? Because let me tell you this. If a companion narrates a detail, a specific matter in a hadith, there's always a reason for it. Because think about how many details haven't been mentioned to us. We don't know what time of day it was. We don't know what type of clothing they were wearing. We don't know exactly who was sitting. So many details. So this detail is mentioned is because it has some significance. Right? And that's why in a hadith, every time, and this is for those of you studying Islam or you study hadith, remember this principle that if there is a detail that a sahabi gives to us, that has been narrated to us, there's always a reason for it. Sometimes we know it, sometimes we don't. That's another matter, but there's always a reason. So why would Khalid bin Walid mention that particular detail? Right? That he is sitting in front of the Prophet ﷺ, he's chewing it, and the Prophet ﷺ is looking at him. Right? Well, some people say it's to prove that it is halal. No. Because the Prophet ﷺ already said it's halal. That's not the purpose. If the hadith had ended there, when the Prophet ﷺ said no, it's not haram, we already got the ruling. What is the wisdom? What is the point that Khalid bin Walid is trying to make? And the point is this. He's trying to tell us, he's trying to convey to us that there is a difference between cultural preferences and Islamic preferences. That what did Khalid bin Walid do? He clarified, is this an Islamic matter? O Messenger of Allah, in essence, what he's saying is, O Messenger of Allah, did you leave this because Islamically it's not good? Prophet said, no. Islamically, not a problem. But my personal culture, the Prophet says, I don't like it. We're not used to it. And Khalid bin Walid then sat in front of the Prophet and ate it, even though the Prophet didn't eat it. And I often tell my students, I say, look, imagine two religious brothers, practicing brothers, mashallah. They were in the same scenario with the Prophet from our time, right? Imagine they're sitting with the Prophet and the same thing happens. The Prophet doesn't eat the lizard. And then one brother, he picks up the lizard, he starts eating it. What would the other person say to him? He would say, Astaghfirullah. What kind of Muslim are you? The Prophet said, I don't like it, and you're going to eat it? Astaghfirullah. Don't you love the Prophet ﷺ? Don't you care about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ? Don't you want to follow Islam? Why would we shame this person? Because we don't understand that there is a difference between the culture of the Prophet ﷺ and the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is why knowledge of the deen of Allah is so very, 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 very important. Because the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like I said, it doesn't change. And in the deen of Allah, we don't compromise. Right? If something is from Islam, it's from Islam. Done. Over. That's it. No more discussion. But when it comes to culture, then culture is malleable. Culture is changing. And that's why in cultural matters, there is allowance. We can move. We can shift left or right. We can go according to the norms of the culture. So here, Khalid bin Walid was able to distinguish between Islam and culture. And because he understood that it's not a religious matter, it's not an Islamic matter, he felt no problem doing something the Prophet ﷺ himself, not only did the Prophet ﷺ not do it, the Prophet ﷺ said, I don't like it. And no one shamed Khalid bin Walid. No one said, how dare you eat something the Prophet ﷺ didn't eat, or how dare you eat something the Prophet ﷺ himself didn't like. Because they knew this was from the culture of the Prophet ﷺ, not from the religion that the Prophet ﷺ has come to teach us. And the question comes up, how do we know? How do we know? Is something from the culture or something from the religion? We know with knowledge, with understanding of the deen, with understanding of the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why learning our religion, especially living as a minority in a quote-unquote foreign culture, or a culture that we may not be familiar with, is extremely important. Because when we talk about assimilation, when we talk about the melting pot, when we talk about things that we can change about ourselves, or things that are allowed to be different from our identity that we are used to, if it is from the culture, then it's no problem. And the companions never found it to be a problem. But if it is from the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then no. There's no melting pot. We don't melt our aqeedah. We don't melt our beliefs. We don't melt our morals. So if tomorrow all of this society decides that it is okay that you know what, only a small group of people have the right to health care and the rest of them don't, we don't say no, we have to assimilate. We have to melting pot, and we're okay with that idea. We don't buy into that, because Islamically we know that it is not okay that only few people have access to health care and other people don't. Islamically we know it is not okay that only 1% of the society has all of the wealth, has the majority of the wealth. Islamically, it's not okay that our neighbor goes hungry. Islamically, it is not okay that there are homeless outside. Islamically, it's not okay that people are oppressed. It's not okay. We don't buy into that. That is not assimilation. Assimilation can happen in our culture in matters that there's allowance for. And not only, subhanAllah, not only is it allowed, the Prophet even encouraged it. He encouraged people to practice their culture. And he warned the companions not to make sure that you don't destroy people's culture. Right? In another incident, the hadith of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, and this hadith, to many people it seems very insignificant, but it's actually a very significant hadith. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari, in which Aisha radiallahu anha, she tells us that she was with one of the Ansari women on the day of her wedding. And then they came across the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ asked Aisha, he said, "Hal kana ma'akum lahu?" He said to Aisha radiallahu anha, Prophet ﷺ said to her, he said, "Did you have any entertainment?" Meaning at the wedding. And he said after that, فَإِنَّ الْأَنصَارِ يُحِبُّونَ لَهُ. He said, for the Ansar, they love entertainment. What is he talking about here? What is he saying? Well, what he's saying is, and this is why Islamic knowledge is so important, what he is saying here is that, look, this is a different culture. Because the culture of the Prophet ﷺ and the culture of Aisha, where were they? What city were they from? What city were they from? Mecca. They emigrated to Medina. And even those two cities had two distinct cultures. And I know in our times, a couple 100 miles, we don't think of a different culture, right? We're like, it's all the same. But back in that day and age, when it took, a long time to travel, a few 100 miles, meant that there were two very distinct cultures. So Medina had its culture, Mecca had its culture. Medina had certain things that were normal in Medina, and Mecca had certain things that were normal in Mecca. And that is why, by the way, the companions had a difficult time adjusting to Medina. Did you know this? Many of them, they felt ill. They became sick because the air quality was different. The norms of Medina were so different, and that's why, we would think, subhanAllah, today, why was it such a hardship for the companions to move from Mecca to Medina? Right? Because in our time, we're like, yeah, it's the same thing. Right? Mecca, Medina, whatever. It's like Jersey and New York. Right? Same thing? Same thing? No. Right? Depends on who you ask. If you ask people who don't live in Jersey and New York, they're like, khalas, same thing. Right? It's all the same. But if you're from New York or from Jersey, there's a very distinct difference, right? But that was even more so the case at the time of Prophet ﷺ in Mecca and Medina, because they were separated. And that is why the companions, they had such a hard time to leave what they considered, like Mecca was their home. They were born and raised there, and they were familiar with the culture. To them, going to Medina was going to a foreign place. And so what happens? The Prophet ﷺ is from Mecca. Aisha is from Mecca. And so during the wedding of an Ansari woman, the Prophet ﷺ reminds Aisha, he says, did you have entertainment at the wedding? Why? Because the people of Mecca, the way they celebrated their weddings was very different. The people of Medina, the Ansar, their weddings were a little more lively, right? We know, we have specific narrations that mention two things, as-sawt wa duf, right? Singing and the playing of the hand drum, the duf. That was common in Medina. That was part of their culture. And that's how you would even know that a wedding is taking place. You would all of a sudden, you would hear singing and you would hear striking of the duf. That was not common in Mecca. So the Prophet reminds Aisha, did you have this entertainment? Because, oh Aisha, you're not used to it. That's not your norm, but don't alter somebody else's culture. Right? Don't change their culture. فَإِنَّ الْأَنصَارِ يُحِبُّونَ لَهُ. The Ansar, they enjoy entertainment. Right? This is part of their culture, meaning Islamically, as long as nothing haram is taking place, khalas, it's the culture. So not only did the Prophet allow for it, the Prophet encouraged it. And that is why I think a lot of these problems that we have today, and people ask, where do we compromise? Where do we assimilate and where do we not assimilate? Or, what part of our identity can melt into this melting pot? Well, the answer to that is we have to educate ourselves about those matters of our deen which there is no compromise on, right? Someone says, subhanAllah, worship other than Allah because you're American, we would say, a'udhu billah. We would never do that. Someone says, as an American, you know what? You lead a busy life, so you can't pray 5 times a day. We would say, never. This is part of our Sharia. This is part of Islam. We would never change that. But someone says that, you know what? Because you're going to a job interview, you should wear a suit and tie. We would say, yeah, obviously. That's the culture. That's the norm of the people. Right? And that's why Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah ta'ala, when he's talking about the sunnah of the Prophet sallam, and he was talking about the dress of the Prophet sallam, what did he say? He said the sunnah, the way of the Prophet sallam. What the Prophet sallam, if you want to talk about what is sunnah, the sunnah of the Prophet sallam is that the Prophet sallam wore what the people wore. Right? He didn't have a distinct Islamic dress. Did Islam come and all of a sudden the companions started wearing different clothes? Is that what happened? No. As a matter of fact, if you were to transport back 1400 years ago today, right? Let's say somehow you got a hold of a time machine, right? You get into the time machine, you go back and you show up on the day of the Battle of Badr, where you have Muslims on one side, the pagans on one side, two very distinct armies about to go to war. And if you landed there, you would look at both sides and it would take you a moment for you to figure out which side the Muslims are. You know why? Because they looked the same. They wore the same clothing. They wore they had the same, their habits were very similar. The men had beards and turbans and so on and so forth. So you would look at them and say, well, which ones are the Muslims? In our day and age, we try to identify Muslims by their clothing, right? But back then, the pagans and the Muslims, the mushrikun and the Muslims, they looked exactly the same. Because Islam didn't come to give us specific articles of clothing. Islam gave us guidelines, for example, when it comes to our clothing. Because within those guidelines, there is room for our culture. Yes, modesty is part of Islam. We should wear modest dress, but modesty is a guideline. Within that modesty, there is room for our culture. And that's why Ibn al-Qayyim, he said, the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, the way of the Prophet ﷺ is to wear what people normally wear in the society that you are living in. That is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And you'll hear people say like, no, sunnah is to wear a thobe, or if you talk to Pakistani, the way they say, wear shalwar qameez, or depending on a person's culture, they'll tell you, no, this is sunnah. The sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is to be part of the culture that you are living in. And actually, subhanAllah, there's a concept known as libas al-shuhra, a type of clothing that makes a person stand out and seem foreign. And people have this idea that as a Muslim, we're supposed to be foreign, we're supposed to look foreign if we're a minority, and that's not the case. Yes, as I said, we have guidelines. Islam gave us guidelines. Islam gave us certain principles. But within that, there is room, and that's why when we talk about, different generations, and parents ask me, what do I do? My kid's becoming Americanized. I'm like, so? What do you mean by Americanized? If you mean by Americanized that they're losing their Islam, yeah, that's a problem. But if you mean that they're dressing differently and they're talking differently, and maybe they, they don't like the same food you like, or their habits are different, and so on and so forth. I'm like, so? Because who said that you can't be American and Muslim at the same time? Right? Why is it that when someone comes to Islam, we strip away their culture? Right? Because Americans deserve Islam just as much as Pakistanis or Saudis or Indonesians or Malaysians or anybody else. Why is it that we can't have a distinct American Muslim culture? I mean, we have no problem allowing the Pakistani to be Pakistani Muslim. We have no problem allowing the Egyptian to be Egyptian Muslim, or the Indonesian to be Indonesian Muslim, right? Why is it that we have a problem with someone being an American Muslim, right? And as I said, I know this is a hard pill to swallow for the older generation. I get it. Because the fear is that if my child starts looking differently and talking differently, that it means that they're going to lose their Islam. But I'm telling you that we have to be very careful in how we teach our children. There are certain matters where no, we don't budge. And there are certain matters where there's much allowance. If we become strict on all of the matters, including cultural matters, then we are misrepresenting Islam. And I know kids who are struggling with their identity. And the problem is not Islamic beliefs. The problem is that their parents are telling them to change what they feel to be normal. Because I know somebody who immigrates to this country, right? They're used to a certain lifestyle, they're used to certain clothing, whatever it may be, and to them that's normal, right? But to somebody who is born and raised in America, even if their parents are from a Muslim country, they feel more at home in America than any other country. And I can give you my own personal example. Both my parents are Pakistani, right? They immigrated to America in the late 60s, early 70s, right? If you were to ask me where I feel the most at home, and I've been across the world. And I had this fantasy, by the way, when I first started practicing Islam, that if I went to a Muslim country, I'm going to feel at home. I'm going to feel more connected than I've ever felt in my life. Why? Because you hear the adhan 5 times a day, everybody says assalamu alaikum, and so on and so forth. And what I found was disappointing to me. What I found is that I felt more foreign in quote-unquote Muslim countries than America. And then I began to realize, and I began to study and learn my deen, I began to understand why. That even though the majority of people in America are not Muslim, but there's a familiarity there. There's a culture there that I know better than I know the Pakistani culture. And so if you're going to ask me, I identify as American way more than I identify as Pakistani, because I haven't lived that life. I don't, people ask me all the time about stuff happening in Pakistan. And by the way, in my culture, it's a big problem, right? That they look at anybody who's practicing Islam and they immediately think about like the religious class back home. And I get this all the time, and they're like, what about this happening in Pakistan and this happening in Pakistan? I'm like, dude, I don't know. Like, I don't live there. I haven't lived there. Like, I can't speak for all religious people in Pakistan. I don't know what's going on. But you want to ask me about American Islam? Let's have this conversation. What type of Islam we're leading in America? If American Muslims are doing something wrong, then yeah, we got to have a conversation. And that is why when I speak to American Muslims. Because this is the culture, this is the society we're living in. And we have to come to terms with that. We have to understand where there's give and take and where we don't change our morals. So there, once again, in conclusion, there are aspects of our deen, our aqidah, our tawheed, right? The principles of our deen that we don't change, regardless of how culture changes, regardless of how society changes. And then there are other aspects that there's allowance in Islam for us to change. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وجزاكم الله خيرا.
Hello? Okay. Jazakallah khair, Sheikh Saad Taslim, on your insight on culture's place in Islam and how Islam has no one culture and that no one culture has monopoly over other cultures. And touching on the difference between cultural preferences and Islamic preferences, and emphasizing the importance of knowledge of deen, of Islam, to help understand how to properly assimilate without compromising your Islam. So now we have time for questions, and if you have any questions, you can go up to the mic in the middle of the room.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Brother Salim Saad, as Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Toha, Brother Salim. So we are now living. Sha'ad. Okay, we are now living in the United States of America, but something that really bothers inside of my heart. So my background is I'm a teacher. So I have an international student, and some of them just ask a very simple question, but it is very hard for me to answer. Okay, the question is, Mr. Toha, why we have a lot of war in Islamic countries like Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, wherever? So it is very hard for me to find something that's very cruel in, let's say, in Christian countries like in European countries. But the problem is why it could be happen, so I can root the history.
Yeah.
So I may not answer that because this is the blood of Muslim, right? So that's why I need your suggestion how to answer. And the second question is about the real life. Okay, when we are in this country, right, from background of Muslim country, even it is not most, but we can find some of us are in a very not quote unquote in a not a very good condition. Just let's say in line, but. So we are less disciplined than the others, a friend from the other faiths, right? Sometimes we just throw the waste as we wish, but they don't, right? It's
Okay.
bother my feeling.
Right. So let me answer your second question first, since it's fresh.
Okay.
Your second question, I don't agree with the premise. To say that it's only Muslims that don't stand in line and throw trash and stuff. Have you been to Singapore?
I was living there for 3 years.
Yeah. Do people throw trash on the street?
But
Do Muslims throw trash on the street?
yeah, but they are not a Muslim community. Mostly are Chinese.
No, but there's a large Muslim population in Singapore as well. So look, the reality is that these are cultural matters, right? And I don't think it's fair to make a generalization and say that, it is only Muslims who do this. It may be that in certain Muslim countries, it's not the norm to stand in line. And I tell you, I've been in Muslim countries, that norm has never been established. So when you come to a country where the norm is to stand in line, then obviously you're less likely to follow those rules. But I think your first question is more important, and there's a very, very simple answer to that. A one-word answer. Are you ready? Colonization. That is the reason. And that's why, if you look at war-torn countries, it's not just Muslim countries. You know what it is? It's countries that have been colonized. Because how did colonized lead? I mean, that's the brutal, honest reality. That's the real answer to why that part of the world is a mess. Why is it that the European countries are doing relatively fine? Because they were the colonizers, not the ones who were colonized, right? The nature of colonization was to come to a land, to disrupt the natural process of that culture and that society, to take and to steal their resources, and then when you have to move out, you leave it in a state of chaos, right? And that's why how much of Africa is still trying to recover from being colonized. The Middle East, Asia, so on and so forth. It's not Muslim specific, right? And I don't agree, by the way, I don't agree with the premise also that, some people say that the West or Western countries, they target Muslim countries. I don't think that's the case. It's not about the faith. It's about the resources, right? Those who colonized, they targeted areas that had resources. And yes, a lot of them were Muslim areas, and some of them weren't. And that's why if we really look at the problem, the part of the world or parts of the world that have problems today, it's as simple as that, right? It's those parts of the world that were colonized. I mean, I can speak for like my parents' culture, right? When the Brits came to India, right? They didn't just leave India with a nice peaceful state, right? They left them in the middle of a war. That's why we had Pakistan and India until today. They're at war because of that one piece of land that wasn't solved, right? You look at Palestine. When did that problem occur? Well, after the World War II, right? And they left that place and they brought, Jews came to Palestine and they're like, okay, figure it out. And then they left, right? They took away lands from Palestinians, gave them to Israel, and khalas, till today, we're dealing with that problem. And you can pretty much take a look at any of the, and this is the reality, right? Any of the colonized lands, till today, they're dealing with those problems. Wallah alam.
My name is Lydia Priliani, and I want to ask about a culture about the marriage, because like
Culture of what?
Marriage.
Yeah.
Because like I have a lot of question from my friend, because like in America they didn't believe with arranged marriage, but
They don't believe in what?
arranged marriage.
Arranged marriage. Okay.
Because they know that it's like a love marriage, and they don't think that how we can marry with people just see for 2 weeks or some stuff like that, and we just married with them.
Yeah.
But if we see like in the Islamic cult, it's like the Islamic, I don't think so that they have like something like a love marriage over there, because like they say like we cannot like close to zina and blah blah blah. And I think that if we have like dating, I used to be like, it is a lot of like we are close to the zina one. So, and then my question, how we can deal with that? I mean, with American people or with the people who like the youth people who are in America, raised in America, and they have the culture America, and they cannot doing like arranged marriage anymore, because like they have the eyes of American that you say it, but how you can deal? And when you say in the Pakistani, I think like they have an arranged marriage, very very strong arranged marriage, but over there for me, like because I'm from Indonesia, and there's not a lot of people do arranged marriage, because like okay you can do it, but if you want to have dating, it's fine, like not a lot of like under pressure in the Pakistani, but how we can deal with this one and how I can say to my friend. Thank you.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. So, arranged marriage versus dating. I don't believe that there's only those two options. There is a middle ground, right? Islamically, Islam doesn't dictate to us that our marriage has to be arranged. On the other hand, yes, we have guidelines when it comes to interaction between the genders, right? And the idea or the concept that, love marriages are the way to go, well, statistics show us otherwise, because 50% of marriages that happen by love and by dating, I mean, they don't work, right? So obviously that model is not working. And by the way, I know there's some difference on that statistic. Some people say 40-some%, whatever. Almost 1 in 2 marriages don't work according to the norms of this society, right? So those people say, like, how can you marry someone that you haven't known for years and lived with and so on and so forth? And well, that doesn't work either, right? And that's why you have cases where people date for years and years and years. And like, I knew this one case where this couple dated for 8 years, and then they got married, and a year later they got divorced, right? Like something happened, like that marriage didn't work when they actually had to be committed to one another on the level of marriage. So I understand very much. I get the concept that there is this clash of cultures, right? But I think that Muslims in America, we're still figuring it out. We're figuring out that middle ground where, yes, you don't want to marry somebody that you don't know, right? At the same time, we do want to be careful that we don't get involved in dating and so on and so forth, falling to zina or any type of haram. And that's why, for me, I used to do a lot of marriage counseling. I used to do premarital counseling. Premarital counseling for me is extremely important, because premarital counseling is where you figure out compatibility. And compatibility, I know it sounds very mechanical, but part of compatibility is also, like, do you like the person, right? And that also includes, are you attracted to the person? Do you have some feelings towards the person, and so on and so forth? But it's done in a way which you can judge and get an idea of the compatibility that you have with the person that you could potentially marry. So, as I said, arranged marriages, yeah, I get it. That's the norm back home. And I don't speak for other cultures, right? Like I said in my talk, I can't speak for Indonesian culture in Indonesia or Pakistani culture in Pakistan, whatever. I can speak for American culture or Muslim American culture. And in Muslim American culture, I believe there is a middle ground, right? That we don't have to marry strangers at the same time. We don't want to take it beyond the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I know that's not a concrete, crystal clear answer, but these matters aren't concrete and crystal clear. And that's why I think having a counselor involved, and as I said, premarital counseling and things like that, for me, I have a rule, and that is I don't perform a nikah until I know that the couple has gotten premarital counseling, right? Regardless of what the parents, if the parents are like, no, they don't have to talk and they don't have to meet or whatever, if that did happen, I'm not doing the nikah. It's not going to happen. Or even if they dated, right? They dated for 5 years, I won't perform the nikah, even though they're like, we know each other. I don't care how much you know each other. I need to see if you're compatible. And that's why, once again, premarital counseling for me is extremely vital. Wallahu alam.
Hello. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. So I am an international student from Malaysia, but I'm currently studying in a university here in America. And one of the big things and challenges I face as an international student being part of the MSA on campus is seeing the lack of international students being part of it. So I think in a club itself, I think I'm the only international student that's active, and I could see it through my eyes because I'm also one of the board members that I don't feel like they are treating me justly because maybe of my accent. I say aluminium instead of aluminum. I don't know, and then they laugh. It's like, oh.
Aluminum, but it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay, not to judge, but
actually, aluminium, the majority of the world says aluminium. So
Yeah.
actually, technically we're wrong. So, but anyway. go
So
ahead.
I would like to know, maybe from your perspective, because you grew up here and you know the Muslim American youth, how do we as international Muslim youth bridge that gap? Because I have many international Muslim friends that don't want to join the MSA because number one, they just don't feel invited
Right.
because of that cultural difference.
So let me ask you, hold on, stay on the mic, inshallah. So have you brought this up with the MSA, this concern?
With a few people, but they don't seem to understand my perspective because they thought they were being empathetic enough,
Yeah,
but maybe I did not portray that I needed more empathy.
right. Jazakallah khair. So without a doubt, in any conflict, communication of expectations is vital, right? So whether it be a marriage or even a sibling relationship or whatever, sometimes we need the person we need to communicate, right? And we need to communicate, we need the person to understand our perspective. So I would say without a doubt, it's important, even if it was just you, but you said it's not just you, there's other international students as well. The international Muslim students have needs as well, right? And if there is an MSA body, right, there's an organization called the Muslim Student Association, then Allahu A'lam, but I would say that it should be inclusive of all Muslims, regardless of their background, regardless of how they say aluminum or aluminium, right? They should be inclusive of all Muslims. And that's not always easy, right? So that's something for you to understand on your side as well. They're never fully going to be able to empathize with your situation and your background and your life experiences or the experiences that you're going through as an international student living and studying here in America. But there has to be, that communication has to be open. So what I would recommend, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, is to start that dialogue, start that discussion, and convey to them that you have certain needs and the international Muslim students have certain needs, for them to feel included and for them to have a support system. And lastly, if you don't find that support from the MSA, then maybe this is a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that maybe you can be that resource for other international students. I'm not saying separate yourself from the MSA, but at the very least, when you see other international Muslim students, because you can empathize with them more than others, and you've kind of been through it, and I don't know how long you've been an international student now, but whatever amount of time, that's still experience that you have. So at least you can be that bridge between the MSA and the international students. Wallahu alam.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Yes, one question I feel like I probably should ask is, in America, how should we as Muslims address certain political wedge issues and critiques that separates our religion to everything else in America, such as abortions, gay marriage, polygamy, or regretfully, in AISA radiallahu anhu's case, underage marriage?
Yeah. Okay. So all of those issues are very heavy issues, very big issues. I think tomorrow we have a session where we're going to talk about those issues in particular. My view on these issues is I don't think it should be the burden of a single Muslim to come up with answers and have an answer to all of these questions. I think as Muslims in America, we need to have open and honest discussions about these very real issues and where we stand on these issues, right? And how we live in this society, and dealing with other people's rights, just as we want people to stand up for our rights as well. And like I said, this is a larger discussion, not to sidestep your question. I believe it's a very, very important question, but I think it deserves a good amount of time. And so, if I'm not mistaken, tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala, we have a panel where we're going to go through some of these issues, inshallah ta'ala.
Okay. And one more thing, I noticed that several people had asked something about marriage just now.
Yeah.
I know this is a little dumb and all, but does Islam actually permit polygamy by any chance?
So, okay, that's it. So the reason why I'm smiling and people are laughing is not because it's a dumb question. The reason why people are smiling and giggling and stuff is because this question has a lot of baggage, right? Like as soon as you say polygamy, depending on a person's background and depending on their culture, like so much floods into their mind and their heart. So that's why, yes, technically polygamy is allowed in Islam, or polygyny is actually the correct term, but there's so much more that needs to be said. And that's why I hate to simplify a matter like this.
Okay, that's all I need to know.
So I wouldn't, bismillah, awesome question. So I wouldn't say that it's diluted, but it's a different experience. And a lot of times what I have noticed, and this is a little bit of a generalization, but a lot of how the youth perceive Islam is dictated by the experience that they had in their home and in their community, right? And sometimes it's a good experience, sometimes it's not a good experience. Sometimes it's an accurate representation of Islam, and sometimes it is wildly inaccurate. And that's why sometimes when we see young people being distant from Islam, sometimes it's just an issue of, they haven't been exposed to Islam properly. And I'll give you a very, very real life example. Our relationship with the Quran. I know in my culture, in the Pakistani, Indian culture, more traditional madrasas and schools and stuff, kids being hit or smacked for not reciting properly was very common. And that's why there's a whole generation of young, Pakistani Indian kids who grew up having a very negative association with reciting and memorizing the Quran, right? Versus somebody maybe who, like I think about my kids. I have two children. My elder son, he's almost 4, right? And I'm starting to, teach him the Quran and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I keep even in my mind is that my goal is not to make sure he becomes a hafiz of the Quran. My goal is to make sure, or try my best, that he grows up loving the Quran, right? I mean, that means that I want him to have a very positive association with the Quran, right? That he has positive memories associated with the Quran. Likewise, I'm very protective over my son's masjid experience, You know, in my community, people are like, oh, we don't see your son that much in the masjid or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, because I want to make sure, like, when I take my son to the masjid, I want to make sure he has an enjoyable experience. Because there's a lot of young Muslims who grow up coming to the masjid just being yelled at by uncles and aunties, right? Or being told that I stop running around and sit down and listen, like, and that, you know, whether we like to admit it or not, for some people, it followed them, into their adulthood. Right? So as, new parents or, this generation that's coming out, we should be very, very aware of that. Right? And that very much can affect our kids' practicing of Islam. And there was a study done on people who leave faith, right? People who stop believing in God or become atheists or agnostic. And one of the things that they found was that for a large number of people, they left faith not because someone proved to them that God doesn't exist, but because of a lot of emotional reasons, right? And even within the Muslim community, I don't know, we don't really talk about people leaving Islam, but even speaking to a lot of young people, I can tell you from my personal conversations with people who are having doubts and are struggling with their Islam, whatever, a lot of it's emotional reasons, right? It's the Islam that they saw. And it's and I often tell them, like, look, I know you had this experience as a Muslim, but that is not Islam. That is your experience with Islam. Wallahu alam.
Assalamu alaikum. This isn't a question, but rather you were referring to a session tomorrow to answer some of the brothers' questions. That is part of the Yom Shabab program, and it's just a plug. So if y'all have any other questions along those lines, the exact session you're referring to, getting along in the melting pot, issues within the American Muslim communities, that's at 2 o'clock in Nitrogen. But we have a whole program for
Awesome.
Like college students and up. So come
Awesome.
on through tomorrow.
2 p.m. tomorrow, right? Yes. Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair. Yep.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa salam wa rahmatullah.
I have a question. This question maybe should be asked by youth. I think I just want to represent the youth's voices here in this question. So my question is, how to avoid confusions in youth when they're living in America, having involved or doing the culture, American culture. And in the meantime, also they have to stand up with the Deen, Islam.
Stand up for what?
Yeah, they have to follow the Sharia of Islam.
Yeah.
Majority of youth, maybe they don't know, much about Islam, especially if they do not go to Islamic school. And now, I see this in youth itself. The confusions in here, like for instance, there is mingling situations, or this boy and girlfriend things, or the woman itself, the girls, the youths, they don't have hijab properly, and so on. So I noticed this. It's not because of they not trying to be a better Muslim, but maybe lack of knowledge about Islam. Now, what can you suggest to us as a parents that live in America and we do not put our children in Islamic schools, and as well as for the youth itself, what they should do so that this confusions, these misunderstandings will not happen in there, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.
Wa iyyakum. So first off, look, we all need to be educated Islamically, right? We all need an Islamic education, and I'm not saying everybody has to become a scholar or an alim or anything like that, but at least the core aspects of our deen, right? We need to understand the Islam that we need to practice, right? And that Islamic education, that Islamic upbringing, that Islamic tarbiyah, it's got to come from somewhere. And I often tell parents, like, look, I'm not saying that you have to put your kid in an Islamic school, but they have to find that education somewhere. So if it's not happening in school, it's got to happen at home. If it's not happening at home, it's got to come from somewhere. And kids are, we know, parents understand this. They're like sponges. They take in everything, right? They just want information, and they're learning and they're learning and they're evolving and they're growing. And so those early years are extremely vital. And so as parents, we got to ask ourselves this question. Sometimes we just assume that teaching Islam to our kids is just teaching them a set of rules, right? Like, do this and don't do that and do this, and this is haram and this is haram, this is halal, or whatever it may be. Islam is supposed to be a spiritual part of it's our way of life, right? And the first place that comes from is the parents, right? If kids don't see their parents doing something, then they're, no matter how much we preach to them, they're not going to pick it up, right? And so the household is so, even when kids go to Islamic school, right? And the problem with what I see with Islamic school sometimes is that parents put their kids in Islamic school and they're like, okay, I've done my job, right? And that's why you see kids in Islamic school who are pretty messed up as well, right? And that's why, on the other hand, you see kids who go to public school and they're holding on to their faith. Why? Because they got that support from their home or from their families. I'll tell you, my son, I'll give you a personal example here. He's 3. He's going to be 4 in a little bit. 2 days out of the week, he goes to this preschool type thing. It's not a Muslim place, right? And they were putting up Christmas decorations. And I didn't know this happened until I went to go pick him up, and then his teacher told me that they were putting up Christmas decorations. And my son, his name is Laith, he said to his teacher, he goes, I'm sorry, we don't celebrate Christmas. I mean, he's 3, right? And I know some people, they hear that, they'd be like that's, some people would cringe at that, right? Like, no, don't upset the status quo or whatever, this or that. But my son, he's 3, and he had no problem. He told his teacher, yeah, so we don't celebrate Christmas. And then his teacher goes, okay, what do you celebrate? And he's like, we celebrate Eid. And she's like, okay. So she went and she researched Eid, and she found an Eid poster, and she put up an Eid poster, right? And so for me, and then I talked to the teacher after. She said, and you know what the teacher said to me? That was the most surprising thing. She said, I'm so proud of your son. Right? She's not Muslim. She's Christian. Right? She doesn't celebrate Eid, obviously. She celebrates Christmas. But she's like, I'm so proud of the confidence that your 3-year-old has. Right? And I told him, I said, yeah, we teach our kids. I teach my son that, look, we live in a country where we have people from different backgrounds, different faiths, right? And we can't all be the same. That's never going to happen. We are never going to always be the same. SubhanAllah, even within a same faith and within a same culture, within the same household, right? We differ, right? 2 siblings, they grow up together with the same parents, same habits in the house and everything. For years they live together, and they're 2 distinct individuals, and they disagree and have disagreements and different views and so on and so forth. There's no such thing as everyone agreeing all the time. It's never going to happen. So we got to be pragmatic. And I told the teachers, I said, look, I teach my son, I teach my children that, look, people are different. It doesn't mean we have to be like everybody else, right? Yes, we shouldn't abuse anyone. We shouldn't be disrespectful towards people, and their faith even. And that's an Islamic principle. Prophet specifically told us not to curse other people's gods, not to curse other people's faith, right? We are respectful, but it doesn't mean that we agree. And that's a nuance, by the way, which I don't think is being talked about enough, because we live in a climate now where there's no room for that nuance, right? We can't have nuanced opinions. You're either for something or you're against it, and that's it, right? Either you celebrate Christmas or you hate all Christians. Who said that, right? Why can't we teach our kids that, look, you're going to be different. Like, yeah, there's a lot of you that's going to be the same because you're American, you speak the same language, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that's going to be, you're going to have the same as everyone else, as every other American. But America itself, and I thought about this a lot. What does it mean to be American? And there's a lot of things that we try to attribute to be American that you can't really say is American, right? A lot of American culture has been brought over from other parts of the world because America is a land of immigrants, right? If there's one thing that we can say is truly American, it is that people can be different and still live together in peace and harmony, right? To me, that's what it means to be American, right? So I think Muslims are the best Americans because Muslims should understand that, right? And Muslims understand that, you know, we have a neighbor that's Christian, we have a neighbor that's Jewish, we have so on and so forth, right? Doesn't mean I have to agree, I have to take part in Christmas, right? And it can also mean that I have my own faith. And look, we live in a democracy. We live in a liberal democracy. We signed up for this life. And the life is, and according to the rules of this society, you are free to believe whatever you want to believe. You are free to practice whatever lifestyle you want to practice as long as you're not infringing on other people's rights. That's the basic core concept of a liberal democracy, right? And as a Muslim, we've agreed to that. So we have to live by those rules. Right? And that's why, you know, growing, you know, even in my community, subhanAllah, one of the controversial issues that came up, and I got asked this question, and that is that, you know, people, during Christmas, you know, people will give us Christmas gifts, right? And you're saying we can't take part in Christmas, so, you know, we can't accept Christmas gifts, but when Ramadan comes, when Eid comes, we give, like, Eid gifts to our neighbors and so on and so forth, and we send over, like, you know, food. And one of the things that I said, and some people didn't like my answer, but I stand by it, and that is that I don't think we should be telling our neighbors to take part in Eid and Ramadan and so on and so forth, because that's not their faith. Honestly, it's not fair, right? It's not fair that Ramadan we're like, here, come, you know, break fast with us, and you eat our Ramadan food, and you eat, you know, Eid food, and here's some Eid presents, but when Christmas rolls around, we're like, sorry, man, I can't accept your Christmas present. Right? What we should be doing instead is that we should be educating our neighbors about Islam throughout the year. We shouldn't send them food just on Eid. We should be sending them food every week. And the sunnah of Rasulullah is what? When you have extra food in your house, what do you do with it? You send it to your neighbor, regardless of their faith. Right? We should be feeding our neighbors throughout the whole year, not just Ramadan, not just Eid. Because just like, you know, we don't take part in Christmas celebrations, or we don't want to be forced to take part in something that, you know, is not part of our faith. Likewise, I don't think it's fair to force someone to take part in something that's not part of their faith. Right? And I'm telling you, it is very short-sighted. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, but I think it's very short-sighted to teach people Islam based on our rules. Right? Because if we really, like, you know, it's one thing if you're like an immigrant and you're going to live here and you're going to go back home. Like, that's not my, like, I'm here to stay. Like, I don't know any other country other than America. I was born, raised here. You know, for me, this is part of my identity, right? And part of that means that it has to be a sustainable Islam. And that sustainable Islam only happens when I'm free to practice my faith, right? Just like other people are free to practice their faith. And sorry for the long answer to your question. Wallah alam. Naam.
Thank you so much, Jazakallah khair. I just want to make an announcement to the audience here, the youth especially. Sheikh Saad Taslim is one of the Al-Maghrib Institute's instructor. And alhamdulillah, I've been the student of Al-Maghrib Institute. I live in, by the way, in Maryland. I work in Al-Huda School, where you used to be there too.
Okay.
Yeah, his little sister, so that's his name. Alhamdulillah. So for the youth here, inshallah, Indonesian youth who's not familiar with Al-Maghrib Institute, please join, inshallah, when they have classes. Now, sometimes they have classes in seminars in New York or in Virginia or in New Jersey, Maryland. Sheikh Saad Taslim will sometime, give the lectures, the seminar, and it's really great lectures. And alhamdulillah, jazakallah khairan for coming to this Muqtamar.
Wa yakum. Allah yabarak fik.
Okay, so that concludes our session. Jazakallah khair. Again, Sheikh Saad Taslim, for your time and insights. And thank you all for coming to attend this lecture. I hope we've all gained something and taken something out of this lecture. So with that, I will close. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik wa ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.